If you turn on any television, you flip through any newspaper, scan the radio dials, you will inevitably encounter a raging debate about what's right and what's wrong with public education. And you'll hear conflicting paradigms about the purposes of education and competing agendas for how to reform or to transform it. On the one end of the spectrum, we hear the dominant narrative, a corporate education agenda backed by government policies and wealthy funders that promotes standardized testing and curriculum, school privatization, union busting, attacks on ethnic studies, and much more that we will be talking about throughout Flashpoint's education series in the weeks ahead. And on the other end of the spectrum is a growing resistance and blossoming movements for anti-oppressive, culturally relevant, and socially just education. But these debates and these struggles didn't begin in the 20th century. They didn't start with George Bush or his corporate buddies or their No Child Left Behind policies. In fact, they've been raging since the colonizers, the slave traders, and the settlers invaded the indigenous peoples of this continent and set up shop on the land that we now call the United States. Today, we want to look at that historical context for these competing narratives and paradigms and movements in education. And to help us do that, we are excited and we are honored to be joined by Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. He is Dean of the School of Education at the University of San Francisco. He is president of the National Association for Multicultural Education, and he is founding director for the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education. Kevin Kumashiro, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Ken.
Tell us what else is important for us to know about you, who you are, and some of the work that you're doing now.
I grew up in Hawaii and have lived in many different parts of the world. And one of the things that I really appreciated is getting different insights on what schools could look like, as well as what has become really commonsensical in different spaces about what schools should look like. And it's an important reminder for me that what we take to be common sense can really vary from place to place, just like it can vary from time to time. And so a lot of my writings, whether it's how we teach in the classroom or how we grapple with policy more broadly, is really tackling this question of what has become the common sense of schools today and what are other ways that might be even better, more important, and more equitable as we try to rethink what schools can and should look like.
Cool. So take us on a little historical journey. Where does the story of public education begin in this country?
So I like to think of the history of public schooling in this country by thinking about where were we drawing from? What were the ideas that we were drawing on as we thought about what schools could look like here in this nation? And so maybe before I talk about the United States, I should talk a little bit about Western Europe, which is where a lot of our ideas came from. Industrialization was happening in Western Europe far before it came to the United States or the North American continent. And what we know is that hand in hand with industrialization was also the continuing colonization of Western European powers throughout the world. So when I think about mass schooling or schooling for the masses, I think about what was happening in these countries both abroad and domestically. And so as they were colonizing countries around the world, they needed to create school systems that would help people to self-govern, that would help people to assimilate into a different social and economic and political structure where they were learning to fit towards the bottom of that hierarchy. So mass schooling was in large part a form of socialization for the colonized. And what we see is that parallel to what nations were building in other nations abroad, what was happening domestically. So as these nations were also going through industrialization, hand in hand with industrialization is often urbanization and the growth of large cities, moving around of people from space to space, which means suddenly we now have these large populations, many newcomers to the area who have to learn how to fit in. So mass schooling, even domestically within these Western European countries, was about socialization, was about teaching the masses to fit into a particular structure of society. Well, what I think is interesting is then to think about the emergence of public education here in this country. And we often think about public education as all about equal educational opportunity and preparing all students to succeed and all of that, leveling the playing field. But the reality is that public education in this country, its predecessor is known as common schools. And common schools emerged in the late 1700s. It was really thriving as a movement until around the Civil War. So for almost a century, we had this thing called common schools, which is kind of this mixture of public and private. And it tended to be one-room schoolhouses. It tended to be very small schools that were serving some of the more elite in this nation, right? Before the advent of common schools, it was really, how were we teaching children? Well, we were teaching them through tutors that maybe wealthier families were bringing in. And we tended to offer different groups of people were giving different education to their children, right? Boys were getting different education from girls. White children were getting different education from children of color, and so on. Well, the common schools was therefore for the more elite. It tended to be boys from white American families and families that owned property. And what we see in the common school era was that even way back then, academics were not the only thing that was the purpose of schooling. Academics went hand in hand with moral education and socialization, right? The most common literary textbook, the most common reader at the time for decades really was called the McGuffey Reader, which was teaching students to read by using really this kind of fire and brimstone Protestant stories about how you need to kind of follow the teachings of the church or you'll perish in hell kind of thing. So it was very hard, even way back then, to separate academics from moral education. And so that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Socialization has always been a goal of education, whether we're talking about the masses or the elite. But then what we see in the late 1800s, early 1900s was a major shift. Because at this time in this nation, we were going through our own industrial revolution. And coinciding with industrialization was the growth of large cities. So industrialization went hand in hand with urbanization, which also went hand in hand with immigration. Large groups of people were immigrating from particularly European nations at the same time that we were building these larger and larger cities. So all of a sudden now we were at this place where we were asking ourselves, well, how do we kind of control this large population, many of them newcomers to this country? And so it's not surprising that this was the time when we saw large public urban systems begin to develop, particularly in metropolitan areas in this country. And what's interesting is that the schools that we developed now for the masses looked really quite different than the schools that we were developing a century earlier for the more elite. The schools for the masses began to really mirror a lot of the elements that we saw in factories. So we began to divide students much more. We divided them by age. We divided them by, and many times, gender. And we also began to compartmentalize the work that they were doing, just as we see in factories. So we began to divide by subjects and divide by time and so on. And it's also the case that the curriculum became less about kind of thinking and reading and writing and expression and creativity. It became much more about rote memorization, much more a curriculum that really taught you to follow rather than taught you to lead. And this is the beginning of public education, right? So we could say, yes, public education began for the most elite, and as we were forced to integrate more and more people, we came up with more and more ways to sort students. I like to make the argument that although we often say the purpose of education is around helping everyone to succeed, leveling the playing field, equal educational opportunity, the function of schools has always been to sort and differentiate. We just came up with more and more indirect ways to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm. Say a little bit more about who was included and who was excluded from the educational system. Because at what point did the idea of free and compulsory education come in? The myth is that, by the 1800s, we start to get free and compulsory education, and then there's an equal right, at least, if not an equal opportunity for everyone. But on the other hand, slaves weren't allowed to write, and in 1852, it wasn't legal for African Americans to be in schools in California. So talk some about who was included and excluded in 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s in schools.
Yeah, that's such a great question. When common schools were created, one of the ideas was that we should teach everyone a common curriculum, right? And the ideal was also that it would be free. But free for whom is really the important question, right? And obviously it was not meant for the peasants. It was not meant for the day laborers. It was not meant for enslaved peoples, and it was not even meant for girls in many instances. So we began to broaden who we think schools were for. But even when we agreed that different groups of students, particularly those from the margins of society, should be allowed into schools, we began to create separate schools. So in the 1800s, what we saw was many separate schools being created for girls, separate schools being created for people of darker skin. And certainly by the late 1800s, we were seeing really a burgeoning of schools for different groups of people. And a really great example would be the burgeoning of boarding schools for American Indian students, right? That really proliferated all throughout the country in the late 18 and early 1900s, as well as even for immigrant populations. I can think of schools that were created for Asian immigrant students in Hawaii, which is where I grew up. And in both the schools for the Asian immigrant students as well as the schools, the American Indian boarding schools, what we see here is a very explicit goal of Americanization, right? This is all, the major goal here was to teach students where they fit into the structures of this society. And in fact, one of the kind of unofficial mottos or mantras of the American Indian boarding schools was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, right? It was about losing parts of yourself that we devalue as a nation so that you can fit into a particular space that we're creating for you in this nation. And you could argue that throughout education, even as we began to incorporate more and more people, the curriculum was still one that differentiated, right? So there are many ways to sort. We can sort through separate schools. We can sort through separate classrooms as we do through tracking. But we can also sort ideologically through the curriculum and what we teach and how we then expect you to participate in the society.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the boarding schools. I know that in those indigenous boarding schools that it was not legal for Native Americans to speak their language or to be taught in their language. And I know that people these days are kind of familiar with recent efforts around English only, but there's a history to that. Can you say some, like, for example, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when the U.S. took the northern half of Mexico, it was promised that the people who lived here could continue to speak Spanish, including in education. So what's kind of the antecedents of the modern English only? Like, what was happening in terms of language in earlier centuries?
Right. I think throughout our history, we can see a lot of fear of difference. Again, it goes back to some of my earlier comments around what has become the common sense and really questioning common sense. So often, common sense gets in the way of our ability to evolve as a society or as a culture. One very commonsensical idea is that the more we are alike and the more we share, the stronger we are and the more unified we can be and the more and the more kind of cohesive we can be as a group. Well, what that then suggests is that if you're trying to strengthen a community that has people of all sorts of differences, the goal must be to get them to lose those differences. The American Indian boarding school was based on, this is called the American Indian boarding schools, right? It's based on the idea that what makes this group of children more, quote, savage is the elements of native cultures. And so really the goal of the boarding schools was to get them to lose as much of those cultural attributes as they can, and language was one big part of it. So much of, quote, Americanization movements throughout the 1900s was exactly about that. It was not only that you needed to learn mainstream American ways, which tended to be more Protestant, more certain cultural traditions from Western Europe. Our particular way of thinking about language, about social class, all of that, it's a very narrow definition of what it means to be American, right? It's not only learning that, it's also explicitly about letting go of everything else that's preventing you from coming together. And language is also something that can be very fearful, I think, for people who don't have an appreciation of diversity, because it's one of the ways that we think people who are different are coming together and plotting, or coming together and weakening solidarity by becoming too close to themselves, right? We see it's like with a lot of the court cases around hostile climate, discrimination, there's this fear among many people that if you're speaking another language, you must be talking about me. And so one of the things I think that we need to really question is why we think cultural strength or the strength of various cultural groups, including language, can actually be a weakness to our society.
That's deep. You talked a little bit about the experience around gender in the earlier history in the U.S. Can you address that around both gender and sexual orientation in early history of education in this country?
Definitely. There's some really interesting research that has come out in the past couple of decades around the teaching profession. And I think about this book written by Erica Miners called Right to be Hostile. And one portion of the book talks about this really interesting piece of art called White Lady Bountiful. And it's this painting that was done where you kind of have green pastures, dark brown bodied people working, and this white woman in a flowing white dress kind of floating above the sky, floating in the sky above the land. And this was supposed to symbolize this idea that one of our goals, and really one it's sort of fitting in with the whole manifest destiny kind of ideology, is that we are actually supposed to not only conquer but save and uplift the other peoples, right? The people that we define as the other. And education was one of the primary ways that we did that. And in the early American imagination, the young white woman played a central role in that uplift. Well, what's interesting is that over time, the image of who that woman should be shifted. There are times where we feared, for example, a strong older woman as a teacher because we feared that that might emasculate our boys, right? There were also times that we preferred the younger woman because we felt that their job really was to get married and be a wife and a mother. And so seeing women move into an entire profession of teaching was scary. It destabilized that kind of view of what the domestic sphere should look like. So there's all kinds of shifting ideas of who should be teaching and the role of women and the image of the kind of woman we want to be teaching, right? Especially if a woman is teaching too much, working too much outside of the home, therefore isn't getting married and having children, should we be fearful that she's becoming a spinster or becoming a lesbian or in other ways becoming a deviant sexually, which can then have dangerous consequences for our young children, right? The fear of sort of sexual contamination definitely predates the modern controversies around gay and lesbian people. There's a long history to that, definitely. But I would also say what's interesting around gender and education is the shifting ideas around the place of girls in schools. I like to talk about how about 100 years ago, it was kind of commonsensical to say that girls should not get too much education. And there are all sorts of reasons why we said that. We said, well, girls, eventually belong in the home, so they don't need to be learning all the things that boys are learning. Or if they learn too much, maybe they'll compete with men for jobs or become too strong. But there was also a science of the time that was telling us something like this. The mind is connected to the body. And if you mess up with one, you might mess up the other. So if girls got too much education, they might go crazy, or they might become physically ill, or they might even become infertile. Well, now we look back and we say, wow, that's a pretty strange thing to say. Like, if you get too much education, you might not be able to have babies. But my point is that about 100 years ago, that was kind of the common sense of our time. And it's interesting, just like when I was talking about the teachers, it's interesting to track how over time the common sense or the kind of stereotypical ways of thinking about difference has shifted. And it's important to then ask ourselves, well, what has become the common sense of today that we're not even seeing, right? Just as we thought that it was kind of strange to think that girls shouldn't get too much education, it might make them, infertile 100 years ago. Today, what are we not seeing that has become so commonsensical that it's actually hindering our ability to see what's really problematic in education and what might be better solutions?
Mm-hmm. Let's roll the timeline up until the last 50 years. How much have the purposes, the curricula, the teaching methodology, some of these common sense ideas of the past actually changed in the last 50 years compared to earlier history? And to what extent are they fundamentally just another version of the same continuum?
It's interesting to think about 50 years ago because I think a lot of people who are pushing for certain kinds of changes in education look to some idealized past, some kind of golden age, often harkening back to around the 50s, as if things were all great back then. So let's think a little bit about what was happening in the past 50 years. One of the things that we know has happened over the past half a century is the emergence of the civil rights movement and its impact on education. During the civil rights movement, there are several things that happened. One, of course, one of the things we often point to as launching us into a civil rights movement was movements towards desegregation and the precedent-setting cases, and then the Supreme Court case in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. Well, that's an interesting case study, right? So we said in 1954 segregation is unlawful. And then for about 10 years, we didn't really do anything until around 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. And that launched this nation into about a quarter century of desegregation programs around the nation, really, mandating desegregation as a way to address inequities in schools. However, by the late 1980s, we began to enter a period when a lot of the court-mandated desegregation programs were expiring. And as these programs began to expire, we returned to what we've always used to assign students to schools, which is residence. And given that our neighborhoods are incredibly racially segregated, it's not surprising that our schools became increasingly segregated. So we were actually making quite good progress from the mid-1960s to the late 1980s. This is the period that we can actually call a desegregation period. And particularly for African American students in the South, we saw significant changes. But from the late 1980s to today, we've entered a period that historians are calling resegregation. Our schools are becoming increasingly segregated, so that today, in some areas, our schools are even more segregated than they were in the past. The civil rights movement is important not only because of desegregation, but also because of curriculum. And because of pedagogy. The launch of kind of multicultural education as a movement really happened during this, really got its start in the civil rights movement. Curriculum in terms of what we teach, pedagogy and instruction in terms of how we teach, this was all beginning to change. We were beginning to say we need to make the curriculum reflective of the diversity of our country. We need to learn, students need to learn that what they're studying in school has relevance to their lives and to the problems they experience. We need to tailor how we teach to the different styles and interests of our children. So curriculum and instruction was changing. And what's interesting and what we often forget to talk about when we talk about the so-called achievement gap, the difference in test scores between different groups of children, is that the achievement gap was actually closing in the 1960s and 70s, right? And even into the 80s. What we see in the past 2 decades is that the achievement gap has been increasing, and that aligns with several things. It aligns with things like the attacks on multicultural curriculum. So as more and more attacks emerge that says, no, we need to go, quote, back to basics, right? The big movement in the 1980s. As we move towards standardizing curriculum, high-stakes testing, and with high-stakes testing comes a narrowing of the curriculum and arguably much less complexity and much more, quote, dumbing down of the curriculum. All of these things are getting us away from the changes in curriculum and instruction that we saw in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's not surprising then that the achievement gap is increasing, and we're seeing a lot of exacerbated problems in terms of inequities in education. So that, I think, is some ways to think about how what we saw about or over the past century has actually shown that there can be gains made, but there can also be retraction, and that's the kind of period that we're in right now. Mm. And let me just say one final thing, which is we can see a lot of very important analysis of the growth of kind of conservative movements in this country as very much responsive to the civil rights movement, right? A lot of conservative organizations, think tanks, foundations, that whole network really emerge in large response to people looking and seeing that there are important law and policy changes being made as a result of a kind of a long-term broad national movement. And so a new movement took birth, right, in the 70s, but particularly gaining speed in the 80s, known as the conservative revolution in this country, that also targeted changes in policy, in law, and also in kind of national consciousness, in shifting the common sense about things. Well, this movement has absolutely turned a lot of its attention to education. So a lot of what we see as school reforms today had its birth in kind of conservative organizing decades earlier, right? Including things like how we think about standards and accountability. we think about standards and accountability as defining today, but let's look back at who was first proposing a lot of these ideas. In fact, even things that the political left, the more liberal movement, might see as, quote, our initiatives, we can sort of do some analysis to say, well, maybe those were things that emerged also from the political right, right? Things like the achievement gap, things like certain ways that we talk about racial inequities, they actually have their births in the 1980s with a lot of the work that the conservative movement was doing. So it is important, again, that we question, where do we get these frames? Where do we get these ideas? What has become really commonsensical? And are we really appreciating the history of how these things emerged?
Mm-hmm. So we started to shift gears and talk about some of the historical movements that were bringing about changes in the 60s around the civil rights movement. I'd actually like to go a little deeper into that and talk about not just who was fighting for a more inclusive education, desegregation, but also who was starting to offer alternative paradigms and actual models. Things like the freedom schools or other kinds of alternative visions of education. Can you talk a little more deeply about educational models maybe that came out of the Black Liberation Movement, the Chicano movement, indigenous movement, and other visions of social justice education?
Yeah. The freedom schools is such a great example of us as a society really questioning what else can schools look like. So freedom schools throughout the civil in the heart of the civil rights movement in this country were popping up in church basements, in people's garages, in community spaces, right? In lawns. I mean, there were really kind of these emergent spaces where people were coming together to say, really, our responsibility as members of this society is to broaden our awareness of what's going on in this society, right? And really to say education needs to play a role in getting us to see the bigger picture, getting us to understand where is inequity, how can it look very differently from place to place, and why do we often not see inequity? Like, what's masking that? What is kind of blinding us to that? That's like a big part of what the freedom schools were really all about, right? Because there was this thinking that if you could see the bigger picture, if you could see behind the veil, behind the mask, you would be much more of an engaged member of society. You would become someone who is invested in transforming this work and really pushing for change, not simply being, in other words, an object of history, but really being a subject of history and being a part of the transformation. And where we see this take life in a whole different space is in higher education around ethnic studies, right? So also in the 1970s in particular, we see kind of in universities, particularly here in the Bay Area of California, a lot of organizing by students who were insisting that we see education as much more relevant and meaningful and reflective of who's in society. In other words, it should be not only including the experiences of different groups, it should actually be able to speak to how current society may not be serving different groups. So it's, in other words, it's not just focusing on the margins. To me, ethnic studies was also focusing on the center and getting us to see how the center needs to really change as well. And ethnic studies is spreading. And, one of the big controversies right now in K-12, elementary, secondary education, is around ethnic studies, such as the big struggle going on in Tucson with the banning of ethnic studies, right? Here we see the exact same kinds of discussion from 4 decades ago, which was all about how should we radically rethink education. What I think ethnic studies advocates are reminding us of is some of the things that I was talking earlier about, which is that curriculum can teach all sorts of things. It goes far beyond more what we traditionally think of as academic skills, like reading and writing and adding and subtracting and so on. Education is about how we view the world. It's about how we view ourselves, and it's about how we view our place in that world. And ethnic studies is really about rattling the stories that we're so often told and expected to just consume. Ethnic studies is about saying, no, our job isn't to simply consume someone else's story of the United States and our place in it. ethnic studies is about imagining how that story could be told differently, and how we might even remake that story into something that truly lives up to the potential of this democratic nation. That's what I would argue ethnic studies is trying to push for. And it's not surprising that, therefore, that's why ethnic studies, for so many people, is a very scary prospect.
Let's talk a little bit for a minute about the role of unions. Right now, unions are a big target of the corporate education agenda on the one hand. And I'm wondering, historically, as well as currently, what you think about the type of role the unions have played, in what ways they've been positive, in what ways they have been conservatizing or oppressive.
Yeah, unions have such an interesting history, particularly education unions. The largest education union, the National Education Association, when it was first formed, well over a century ago, was seen as a very white elite institution. And there was a lot of work to try to merge it with what was then called the American Teachers Association, the ATA, which was primarily a black teachers union. And then there's continuing to see unions morph into different kind of political framings, right? I think, for example, about how maybe 15, 20 years ago, the stereotype of the NEA was much more the insider, and the AFT, American Federation of Teachers, was seen as the more left, the more radical. But then when No Child Left Behind came along, it was the American Federation of Teachers that was more supportive than the NEA. And so we began to shift in terms of how we talked about who was more, quote, progressive, who was more mainstream. So unions have always, my point is simply that unions have always occupied different places. But what I think is interesting when I think about the most recent activity of unions is to look at a union like the Chicago Teachers Union. So again, we see how unions can be seen as very much an insider, very much working hand in hand with the leadership, the government, which I think was the image of the Chicago Teachers Union maybe 3 years ago and in the recent past. But within the past 2 years, the union transformed, right? There was this slate, a caucus within the Chicago Teachers Union called CORE, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, a much more progressive caucus that was trying to say schools need to be much more about equity and justice and democracy, less about the status quo. And so they ran a slate. They actually took over the leadership of the union, and then in the very near future, they led the union to this very highly publicized and arguably very successful strike, right? Strikes in the United States among education unions have very much gone down in the past few decades. We've seen very few strikes happen. And here, Chicago, at the time, was I think the third largest school district in the nation, having this very well-publicized strike that was very much an act of solidarity. I mean, you had well over 90% of the teachers voting, over 90% voted, and over 90% of them who voted to go on strike. It was very much in solidarity. So what I think is interesting is to think about some of the analysis we've seen about tactics of unions, particularly education unions, over the past few decades. So what I'm interested in are the analysis that say that over the past few decades, unions have become much more about trying to work through compromise to make change. It's much more about compromising over policy decisions, and therefore they're often seen as very much kind of hand in hand with the powers that be, right? Well, what Chicago Teachers Union did is they positioned themselves as an alternative voice to the leadership, right, to the government. And so they're positioning themselves, in other words, as an opponent, as an outside group. And their strategies was less around kind of compromising with the leadership. Their strategies was very much the grassroots organizing strategies that we saw decades earlier in unions. They actually were going door to door. They were actually talking to their membership and to community members. And in fact, their messages were very smart, right? What we saw was they were not saying, Okay, so what we hear in the media and by elected leaders, by pundits, by commentators was the union is being greedy. The union is all about lining their own pockets. They only care about money. They're not being realistic. This is a time of, budget constraint and all of that. So the union, what they did is they chose not to go out and say, no, we're not being greedy. Let me tell you how much we're making and how little we've gotten in increases in previous years, right? They weren't actually arguing around salary. What the union would do is they would get up and they would say, you know what? This struggle is about something much bigger. This struggle is about pushing back against the corporate-led reforms that we see happening right now. And if we cannot work in good teaching conditions, then that's going to signal something very problematic about the learning conditions of our children. In other words, what they did is they reframed that whole debate to say that the strike, which while it's not technically about all of these larger reform issues, they were making that connection. They were getting people to see that the strike was part of a larger battle against these very problematic reforms coming our way. So the strategy was different. It was much more grassroots. The messaging was different. It was much more about reframing the debate and seeing the bigger picture. These were two very important moves that I think the Chicago Teachers Union made, which signaled a shift in union tactics. I think that what we're going to see now is, and actually I think it's arguably what we're already seeing, is more of the larger unions watching and seeing whether they can do something similar. Look at what's happening in Massachusetts, right, where the new union president was someone who was a very controversial figure in battles around high-stakes assessments for student teachers at the university level. And now there's a lot of people that her election to me signals that the union wants to rally around pushing back against some of these broader reforms. And you see in other large unions, I won't say which one because I know that the struggles are still going on, but you can see in other large unions caucuses that share that kind of very advocacy, kind of movement building perspective, wanting to take over the leadership so that they can push, or even if they don't take over, at least push the leadership of the union to take different kinds of strategies and different kinds of positions. And I think that's a very exciting, we're in a very exciting moment for union organizing right now.
Nice. So you've actually started to talk about some of the hopeful things for the future of education. Say a little more about the current debate between the sort of the corporate agenda and more social justice-based movements, and what within that gives you hope and what has you most concerned.
Going back to some of your earlier questions about history, I think understanding kind of corporate, what some of us are calling corporate-led or corporate-based reforms, it's important to understand the historical context, some of the historical context for this, right? And again, I like to look globally for my historical context. And one of the ways I try to historicize current education reforms is to look at what was going on globally within the past, really about 7 decades. So what we know, so I used to live in Chicago, which is why I keep referencing Chicago. And what we know is that some of the leaders out of the University of Chicago, kind of Milton Friedman and his students, were really leading a kind of ideological change in this nation and the world around how we think about economic reform, right? And what we saw was within this kind of ideology, the major global institutions, global financial institutions, began to change how they quote, supported economic reform around the world, right? And so what we see in a book like Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, we can see this kind of time after time as nations fell into economic turmoil and they turned to these global financial institutions, they withheld financial support unless those nations agreed to move their economy to kind of a, quote, free enterprise economy, right? They radically decentralized, they radically kind of lifted certain governmental regulations so that it would look like a free market, more like a free market. Well, time after time, what we saw is that free market led to even greater wealth gaps and disparities than before, right? Even greater amounts of poverty and even greater amounts of concentrated wealth. In the 1970s, that neoliberal ideology began to also influence how we treated educational reform around the world. And so reforms in struggling countries like Latin America were economic reforms, were tied to educational reforms, where we were also saying, well, not only do you need to kind of move your economy to a free market, you also need to move your educational system and other institutions to that. And what we saw were some of the countries, or countries with some of the highest literacy rates in the world, we saw those literacy rates plummet. We saw really educational inequities become greatly increased in a very short period of time because the educational system was moved towards this market system. Well, it's sad to then think that that ideology continues to drive both economic reform and education reform today. And so that is one of the, to me, commonsensical ideas that we aren't questioning enough. So a lot of the reforms coming down the pipe from both political parties and even from both conservative and more liberal organizations, is grounded in this idea that if we can marketize education, that's going to drive improvement. And so we're going to create all kinds of choice programs like school choice and voucher and charter schools, right? And we're going to create all kinds of alternative ways to get certified to be a teacher, like through fast track alternative teacher certification, or and we're gonna even change how we fund schools from formula grants to competitive grants. And so there's all kinds of ways in which we see this marketization, and hand in hand with that, of course, is the idea that because the public sector has failed, we need to bring in the private sector to drive improvement. And so privatization is also characterizing how we think about reforms today. Race to the Top is a great example, right, of changing how we fund education to these competitive grants. And, one of the requirements in Race to the Top is you have to show how you're going to outsource, because this is a massive amount of money that you have to spend in a very short period of time, right? So this, to me, is undergirding so much of the reforms that we're seeing right now. But your question about what is the hope? To me, what is hopeful is that we see examples of people collectivizing and pushing back against this frame, right? We don't see merely people battling over policy changes. What we see is people battling over kind of this larger, how do we make sense of education question, right? This larger question of what is the purpose of education and what are the solutions, right? We have people pushing not just against policies that encourage and facilitate privatization, but people pushing against the actual argument that privatization is how we should move. Or even another commonsensical way of thinking about, and it fits in with this whole neoliberal ideology, is this idea that we need to kind of hold everyone accountable. We need to delineate the standards. We need to measure, and everyone who doesn't live up, we need to punish and get rid of them, right? Well, that's not how we should. I mean, there are so many other models about how we can think about school reform. And I think we see people pushing back against that. And so some really concrete examples that give me hope are examples of where constituents of education who are often positioned as either the victims or the objects or whatever, are really taking command and taking ownership and collectivizing in ways that we don't often see. And then a great example would be the collectivizing of teachers, such as this new way of doing union activism and advocacy. But also I think about students who are protesting and walking out, right, in the great tradition of student activism over the past century and around the world, right? Or parents. There's this whole national opt-out movement of parents organizing against high-stakes testing. We have, even in Chicago, this great example of dozens of parent organizations coming together to push back against one of the initiatives that the mayor at the time was launching, which was, lengthening the school day, but not necessarily changing what we do during that school day, right? So I think when I think about the power of, let's say, the civil rights movement or the feminist movement or the Occupy movement or post-colonial movements or I should say anti-colonial movements, a lot of what we're seeing is people thinking about social change in terms of the components of social movements, right? Social movements are not just about changing policy. They're not just about getting a certain person elected. Social movements are about the set of changes that have to happen. We need to change policy. We need to change practices. We need to change who's in the leadership. But we also need to shift public consciousness. And we need to see ourselves as collectives working for something much bigger than any of those one things alone. And I think the more that we can see education as a movement, and the more that we can see ourselves as part of that, the more hope I have for really substantive changes that transform our educational system into something that truly advances democracy in this nation.
That is beautifully said. Is there anything else that you want to address that we haven't covered today?
Those are such good questions. Yeah.
Those are such good answers. I'm going to have a hard time editing because I want to keep it all.
No, I think the things that come to my mind would be really things that would be in your future segments,
Yeah.
the more contemporary
Yeah.
stuff. But the historical stuff, I think we talked a lot about.
You
So this is all
covered that
great.
fantastically. All right, cool. So our guest has been Dr. Kevin Kumashiro, Dean of the School of Education at University of San Francisco, President of National Association for Multicultural Education, and Founding Director for the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education. Kevin, thank you for sharing your incredible wisdom and inspiration with us, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay.